Hello again, friends, and welcome to Madison BookBeat, your listener-sponsored community radio home for Madison authors, Madison topics, Madison book events, and Madison publishers. I'm your host, Stu Levitan. Our guest this hour is Madison author Jen Rubin for a conversation about her book, We Are Staying, 80 Years in the Life of a Family, a Store, and a Neighborhood. In 1934, in the depths of the First Great Depression, a Russian immigrant named Leon Rubin and a friend signed a lease at 2580 Broadway in New York City between 97th and 98th Streets and opened a radio repair shop they called Radio Clinic. They not only survived the Depression, but thrived after the war, selling all sorts of appliances and opening a second store on 83rd Street. If you lived on the Upper West Side and owned an air conditioner, there's a good chance you bought it at Radio Clinic. In 1966, Leon's son Alan left his career as a metallurgical engineer to join the company, outlasted his brother-in-law to become its sole owner, and like his father became a fixture in the neighborhood. It was Alan Rubin who found a way to help the legendary musical archivist Alan Lomax preserve his historic field recordings of folk singers. But goodwill did not protect him from being looted during the 25-hour blackout in the summer of 1977. Nor did it get him the financial or programmatic government assistance he needed to fully rebuild in the immediate aftermath of that terrible night. And yet he persisted, staying at 98th and Broadway and keeping his employees on the job for another 30 years, until the neighborhood revitalization became so successful that the rent became just too damn high. Alan Rubin sold the business in 2008 and could only watch when it finally lost its lease in 2014 and moved to Queens. The story of Radio Clinic is an important story of how urban policy, family ties, demographics, economics, and the human spirit come together and sometimes fall apart as a small business rises, falls, and tries to rise again. It is the story Jen Rubin tells with heart and soul and just the right amount of policy wonkishness in We Are Staying, 80 Years in the Life of a Family, a Store, and a Neighborhood. In addition to her writing, Jen leads storytelling workshops around Madison, co-produces the local Moth Story Slam, co-hosts Inside Stories podcast, and teaches the occasional social policy class at the University of Wisconsin School of Social Work, all part of her long-standing activity for social change. As a devotee of that original yellow Walkman, she is an obsessive maker of mixtapes. There's an extensive one for the book included as an appendix and available on Spotify, and claims to be the best challah baker in town, although I cannot independently verify that. She is also a former professional demonstrator of Atari video games. Her website is rubinjen.com. It is a pleasure to welcome to Madison BookBeat my friend Jen Rubin.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be, well, I guess not here because no one's anywhere, but I'm excited to join you.
As I used to say, how can you be in two places at once when you're not anywhere at all?
Right.
The book opens a little past the midpoint of Radio Clinic's 80-year history, July 13th, 1977, the night the lights went out in New York City and stayed out for 25 hours. Why did you start there?
Oh, I like that question. The reason why I started there is, well, both it was the most dramatic moment for the store and for my dad, but also I was writing a book about a man that almost no one's heard of and a store no one's heard of unless you're from the area. And if you've been in a New York City small business, like they're tiny places, they're not beautiful places. And so why does anyone care, about this business? If I started at the origin, it's just one more Russian Jewish immigrant, who started one more business. So I felt like if I really raise the stakes and show about the store being destroyed, and then my dad deciding like, I'm not budging, I'm gonna stay. I just felt like it got the reader's interest and raised the stakes. So then I could go back to the origin story.
Well, before we go back to the origin, set the scene for what things were like for the store the day before the lightning bolts hit the Con Ed wires and tripped the system. The Big Apple was really not Fun City at that point, was it?
No, it wasn't. And it's interesting because I spent a lot of time thinking about this, because my dad, after he was looted, he put up the sign saying we are staying. And, everybody in the neighborhood, was like, crying and bringing him flowers and really happy that he was staying. And so that always intrigued me, like, why would anyone care outside my family whether one appliance store stayed open? And so the answer to that question is what was happening ahead of time, before that. And so it's hard to imagine now if anyone listening has ever been to the Upper West Side in the last 10, 20 years, because the neighborhood is, you can't throw enough money at the housing now in that neighborhood. But at the time, the city, 2 years earlier in 1975, the city actually drew up bankruptcy papers and was about to declare bankruptcy. The city was in bad position. The Upper West Side was in particularly bad position. Because the way the city did not declare bankruptcy is it had this austerity budget, and no one likes an austerity budget if it's pointing at them. They don't mind it if it points at other people. So the police department had all these layoffs. And the police literally would go, they had these flyers called Fear City, and they would flyer tourists and say, don't come to the city, we can't protect you. I mean, it really was sort of crazy, what was happening. And so there had been a lot of white flight and middle class flight during suburbanization in the late 50s and 60s. And the middle class people who had stayed in the neighborhood stayed because they really believed in an economically and racially diverse neighborhood. But, if it got so bad, they were sort of eyeing the door, like maybe it's just not safe to be here anymore. And so the looting looked like it could be that. And so that was what was going on before it.
1975 is the headline, the New York Daily News, 4 to city drop dead.
Right.
And this would also have an impact on how the police responded to the blackout, because they're in an antagonistic posture towards the city. The city's trying to get them to go to one officer patrol cars, and they've engaged in white flight too, because they're now no longer living in the communities that they're serving or supposedly serving.
Yeah, so that was part of the problem too. So that you have this looting, and so for people who aren't familiar with it, something like 2,000 stores were destroyed, 1,000 were set on fire, and so there weren't enough police to deal with it, and so even when the police commissioner finally called the police in, a lot of them just lived outside the city. And so when they came in from like barbecues or wherever they were, and then they were told to go to where the crisis was and not to their precinct. And so they didn't have any of their equipment. So they're showing up in like Bermuda shorts and, all kinds of things. And so there just wasn't, the fact that a lot of police did not live in the city anymore slowed down the response.
So let's go back to the beginning. And like almost all stories in America, this starts, as you said, as an immigrant story. Tell us a bit about your father's father, Leon, and how he came to start the business.
Yeah, so I think, like a lot of people, he fled where he was from. In his case, it was religious persecution. His father was murdered for being Jewish by a Cossack in Russia. So they came here, fled here, came in illegally, actually, through Canada. And he was 12. And at the time, what was it called? Cooper's College, Cooper Union? Mm-hmm. Cooper Union College was a college that you could go to for free. And so he was learning how to be an engineer. But then he got married, so he stopped going to college and had to get a job. And so he got a job repairing radio for a department store, and then decided just to put out his own shingle. And so he and a friend, threw in together. They had to scrape together $300, because all you needed at the time in 1934 was $300 for the rent and nothing else. You didn't need a bank account. It probably helped that they were white, so the landlord was willing to just take their name for it, but you didn't need a whole lot. That's all you needed. And so they opened it in 1934 during the heart of radio, when everyone had a radio and mostly people repaired their radios. So my favorite image is that the reason why he called the store Radio Clinic is there was 3 other radio repair shops in the neighborhood. So he wanted to distinguish himself. So he sat in the storefront window in a doctor's smock, and he had a stethoscope on, and he had a screwdriver, and he would fix sick radios. And it must have been enough of a gimmick that people came into the store, and pretty quickly they were doing well pretty quickly.
And it's a fascinating image to go from him in his doctor smock repairing radios to you playing video games in that same storefront.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was a glass vestibule. So you literally like had to walk into it, and so I don't really know how to describe it, but it was a vestibule. And so yeah, so in I think it was 1976, 1976 when the Atari arcade games were a new thing. My dad wanted just to see if anyone would buy it. So he put one in the glass vestibule, and it was the Evel Knievel Stun Cycle. And I was paid $1 an hour to play the game because if you're not familiar with that block on 98th Street, probably 10,000 people walk by that, window in a given day. So I got to play Atari right there.
One of the really fascinating digressions about your grandfather's life is that period when he was an informant for the FBI.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite stories. And so this was in the late, it's probably like early 1950s, I guess. And so my grandfather's Russian, but he taught himself English, and he must not have had a very thick accent. And so some Russians came in and wanted to buy a television. And televisions were huge things then. They were big and they were expensive. Back then, you didn't just pay the price. It was always a bartering, a negotiation. So these two Russians were trying to negotiate with my grandfather to get the price down. And so they're talking to each other in Russian to strategize, and my grandfather's answering in English, and they keep trying to say, we can get him lower, we can get him lower. And at some point, my grandfather says to them in Russian, I will go no lower, and so they were very charmed by that. And so they started sending their friends, people from the Russian embassy, people from like the Bolshoi Ballet. And so there were just Russians in and out of the store. And so because this was in the early days of the Cold War, it caught the attention of the FBI. And one thing that I like to imagine, I don't know where the FBI came from, if they were coming from New Jersey or from downtown, but if they had to take the subway, they would have had to walk by the Soviet American Friendship Association building on their way into the store, where they were not interested in any Soviet or American friendship. And so they asked my grandfather if when they showed him pictures of three men and said, if any of these people come in to deliver film, I'd like you to pull the film and call us. And so my grandfather thought about it, and he realized, Russia was not very good to his family. Russia wasn't very good to Jews. And for him, as a European immigrant, the U.S. had been very good to him. So he agreed to do it. And so they would come in all the time and look at the film. And my grandfather was always surprised at how useful they found it. And, since I wrote the book, I started watching The Americans. Have you watched that show? Yeah, I sort of feel like it's like a scene out of The Americans, so.
There's an interesting parallel between the way your grandfather slyly interacted with the Russians and the way your father interacted with the people from Zabar's who were trying to get him. And it's an interesting characteristic of your father's family, the way they can parry the attempts by other people to find out what they're thinking and plan to do.
Well, I really think that's like a old school salesman kind of thing. I just grew up watching salesmen all the time, not just my father, but all the salesmen who worked at the store. And I think people whose life it is to be a salesman are really good at reading human cues and trying to figure out, how to do it.
Now, you were not yet born when your father decided to leave what must have been a stable job as a metallurgical engineer and buy into the company. Did he ever have any second thoughts?
My dad's just not that kind of guy to have second thoughts, deep reflection. Like he's like a just always moving forward kind of person. But I do think he had a good job, but it wasn't that well paying. And at the time, he didn't buy into the business. My grandfather just let him come in. So that didn't cost anything. And at the time that was happening, it was sort of, I write about this in the book, that it's hard to know when you're at your peak, because you don't know what's about to happen. So that was sort of in some ways like the beginning of the end of small businesses really having their heyday, I think, in New York City. So the business, when he came in, I think was doing better than it soon started to do. So I think it was both an opportunity to work with his dad, and also he would make more money, theoretically.
You mentioned the Bolshoi Ballet coming in. the Upper West Side would become the home to a lot of prominent people in the theatrical community, both the 83rd Street store and the 98th Street store, including someone who just passed away today, Jerry
Yeah,
Stiller.
yeah.
Who are some of the famous folks that your father and grandfather did business with?
Ugh, I'm not going to remember them all. I mean, I know, so I only know secondhand with my grandfather, but his favorite was Babe Ruth, who lived in the neighborhood. And I don't, I can't fully confirm that Humphrey Bogart shopped there, but he lived a few blocks away. So why wouldn't he? I don't know. I like to think he shopped there. But it was a lot of, I think a lot of sort of actors that you'd recognize if you saw in movies, but you might not know their names. I don't remember all their names, but it was like Tony Randall, Still in Mirror. I don't know. And then it's just, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. And then this is the Seinfeld neighborhood to a certain extent.
Yeah, no, the diner where they filmed Seinfeld is right nearby. That's where I would there's this one salesman who always wanted a fried egg, like a fried egg English muffin. And so he would send me there to the Seinfeld diner before it was a Seinfeld diner to get it.
So we get back up to the blackout of 1977 and the absolute devastation of the store. The merchandise is stolen, thankfully not all the merchandise. Why was your father's immediate reaction the morning after the blackout that he was going to stay?
It wasn't even the morning after. So my dad was on the other side of Central Park when the lights went out. So he came straight to the store. He didn't know anything was being looted, and he was worried that the motor in the warehouse would short out, and so it's like a water pump, and so the water would start to rise, and then it would short out the freight elevator, and he needed the freight elevator to get air conditioners up, and so he went there to try to hand pump water or something. Like, I don't know what he thought he was going to do, but that's why he went there. And so when he got there, the store was being looted. And so he was standing on the grassy median watching it happen. And he ran a couple times to get some police to try and clear the people out of there, but it was a losing proposition. But anyhow, while he was watching it happen, he heard and saw the glass vestibule was broken. And my dad hated the glass vestibule because it just takes up too much space, and space is at a premium. So as he's watching the store be looted, he's like, "Oh, I can redo the store now. Like I can get rid of the glass vestibule." So he was already thinking forward as it was being looted. As to why he was doing that, I think many small business owners, have a pretty strong optimism in them. Otherwise, they wouldn't do this kind of work. I refer to my dad as a compulsive optimist, so it's possible that it would have been a good idea for him to do a cost benefit analysis as to what it would cost him to stay. But he was never interested in not reopening. And whether that's because he didn't want his father's store to go down on his watch, or whether he wanted to support the neighborhood, I mean, that's hard to parse out 30 years later. But he never wavered from reopening it.
And tell us how this incident leads to the title of the book.
Yeah. So what happened is, so the looting happened in the middle of just like a horrible heat wave. And if you haven't been in a dense city during a horrible heat wave, it's just ridiculous. It's like the heat gets trapped. There's no grass to absorb it. It's just super unpleasant. And so what do you want more than anything else during a heat wave is an air conditioner. And my family's business basically did well or didn't do well based on air conditioner sales. So if it was a hot summer, we were good. If it was not a hot summer, we were in trouble. And so my dad knew that he had to get the store open as quickly as possible during the heat wave and sell as many air conditioners as possible. The reason why air conditioners weren't stolen is because they were down in the warehouse and there was no way to get them out for the people who were doing the looting. There's just no way to get them out. So he still had air conditioners. And so he's trying to frantically get it all together. The freight elevator had shorted out. So getting each air conditioner from the basement up was like a half an hour job per air conditioner. So people kept coming in to ask him what was he going to do? And he just didn't want to take the time to talk to anyone. So he got some cardboard, wrote "We Are Staying," and taped it up on the part of the window that still existed. And then people, like, truly, I think I mentioned this earlier, people truly came in with flowers and they were crying, and they're like, "If you're staying, we're staying." And so it had this huge impact on my dad. He had not expected people to have that kind of reaction. And so that's where the title came from.
We are talking with Jen Rubin. Her book is We Are Staying, 80 Years in the Life of a Family, a Store, and a Neighborhood. Now, you are a notably progressive person. You've done a lot of work in social justice areas. How do you personally process the fact that every neighborhood with a concentration of low-income people was damaged during that blackout, and that the people who did the looting were overwhelmingly African American and Latino?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's something I really thought about, because when the first someone who's editing my book, who's someone who's kind of like a well-known progressive and is a good editor, and he said, "Yeah, you can't start your book with the looting. It's way too problematic. White Jewish shop owner, people doing the looting are most people of color. It's way too problematic." And I thought, okay, because I believe anything anyone tells me. I always assume I assume they're right and I'm wrong. And so I put the book down for a while because like I said earlier, I don't think the book works if I don't have that dramatic moment. And the thing I started to think about is, like, in general, and maybe it's the social policy person in me, I feel like the problem often is that we don't all collectively consider policy and how much it matters, that we think of our lives decontextualized or separate from policy. Same with a small business. I try to weave in policy as much as possible. And so, like, I don't think the problem is that, like, a Jewish immigrant could open a business with no problem. That seems like a fine thing, that you can open a business. The problem is, why couldn't African Americans who'd been in the country or in the city longer than my grandfather, why couldn't they, right? So what was the policy that made that hard? And so in terms of who did the looting, because there had been another blackout 10 years earlier where the power had been out for, I don't know, like 15, 20 hours. And there hadn't been a looting, even though it was the same thing. And so partly it was, well, the unemployment rate was actually 90% for African American and Puerto Rican teenagers. It was at 90%, and that New York had been the biggest manufacturing base in the country, and that with suburbanization, that not only did white middle class people leave, because you could now get an FHA loan if you left the city, and that if you stayed in the city, you could not, and that the loans were not available to anyone who wasn't white, but the manufacturing base left with it, right? So and then if you start looking at the urban renewal policies and how that changed who lived in what neighborhood, and like all of that was the conditions for why the looting happened, and so the looting happened wherever there was poverty. Wherever there was pockets of poverty, that's where the looting was. And where there wasn't pockets of poverty, there was no looting. And that was across the city in all 5 boroughs.
As a folk singer once said, when there's too much and nothing, it makes a fella mean.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was interesting because my dad, and actually I interviewed other small business owners, and they were all convinced that they were pissed at the city. Like, my dad was way angrier at the city than he was with anyone who did the looting. And he was convinced that they sent the police to protect the department stores on Fifth Avenue. And that actually wasn't true. And because people looted where they lived, and no one lived by the department stores. So anyway.
Explain the vicious cycle that hits a small retail business when it's had almost all its merchandise stolen, and what he was facing to survive that period.
Yeah, so I might not get it exactly right, but so how appliance stores, at least at the time, how they bought merchandise was on floor planning, which means so everything that was on the floor to sell, he hadn't paid for it yet, right? So he still owed for all the merchandise, but the merchandise didn't exist. And there's also all these incentives built in, like the sooner you pay back the merchandise, like the lower the cost is for it. You know what I mean? So which allows you to make more of a profit if you can buy it at a lower amount. So then it messed up. So then it had all those ripple effects too. So yeah, so he owed money for merchandise that didn't exist. So that was a problem.
One thing I forgot to mention in talking about the aftermath of the looting was I mentioned in the introduction that your father helped Alan Lomax preserve early folk music. It turns out that by being looted, he in a way helped develop early hip hop music.
Yeah, so this was one of my favorite things I found when I was researching. I came across some article about these two guys. I think it's Disco with I don't remember their names. Anyway, I don't remember their names. But they do a hip hop tour through the South Bronx, and they talked about how the looting really sparked the rapid proliferation of hip hop, and they referenced a book. So I took out the book. I think it was called Yes, Yes, Y'all, and it's the oral history of hip hop out of the South Bronx. And so what happened is in the looting, there were certain stores that were just wiped out, and one of them was electronic stores. If you had an electronic store, and my family business was in part electronic store, there was nothing left. And so it was expensive at the time to be able to have like a hip hop crew. Like you had to have a lot of equipment. And so there wasn't enough equipment for a lot of people per neighborhood. But after the looting, there was, hip hop crews everywhere. And so in the book, they talk about how like that night really helped with the rapid proliferation. So I like to think my dad helped out. So.
How did his experience in the aftermath of the blackout change his relationship to the neighborhood?
It changed it a lot. I mean, my dad's always, he's a nice guy. He's the kind of guy who like, he'll talk to anyone and he'll find something to talk about, and people enjoy talking to my dad. But he didn't really ever think of himself as an activist. That just isn't how he was oriented. And so it really, after that response to the sign, he really took his role in the community pretty seriously. He invested in Symphony Space, which at the time was meant to help anchor a beleaguered neighborhood. I mean, now it's a national performance place. But he also, the neighborhood, within just a few years after the looting, the neighborhood started to gentrify really quickly. And so he got involved in the fight for commercial rent stabilization, and really took that on as a mission.
And became something of a prominent spokesperson for that issue and the neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, prominent, yes. Although my brother likes to point out that probably at that time, there was probably a pretty high concentration of reporters in the neighborhood, which is probably why it was so easy to just walk a couple blocks and talk to my dad, who is always good for a good quote. But yeah, he shows up a lot in newspapers.
How did his approach to doing business and his experience in the aftermath of the blackout affect your interests and career choices?
Well, I hadn't actually drawn as clear a line before the writing of the book to the writing of book of how impacted both my brother and I were. Neither one of us ever wanted to go into the family business. It just was clear that it's untenable to own a small business in a gentrified area. But we both went into different my brother went into policy a lot, and a lot of the policy he's interested in is sort of taking on large systems, which my dad had a hard time, with banks helping and various systems. And I took a real sort of community-based organizing sort of approach to the work I did. And so I think it's a pretty direct line from my dad to what we do. So, yeah.
Was there anybody that he dealt with either in the private sector or the public sector that impressed him as understanding how to help the small businesses and actually getting something done, or was everybody a disappointment?
So this goes back, I think, to my dad's kind of compulsive optimism, which is he firmly believes that every system or institution is not there for the little guy, as he says it, but within that system or institution, there are people who will help you. You just have to find them. And so his advice is you just have to be tenacious. So if it meant he had to call 100 different people, he would call 100 different people. And it might not be till the 99th phone call that he got his help. but he feels like there was always some. He thinks he's a very reasonable man, and if he just searches for the reasonable man or woman, they're there.
The most amazing example of that is in 1981, he's trying to get a new loan from Citicorp, and the loan officers in the bank are not being helpful. So he writes a letter to Walter Wriston, the chairman and CEO of Citibank, the most influential commercial banker of the era, who actually grew up in Appleton. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not know that.
He grew up in Appleton. His father was president of Lawrence University. And Walter Wriston reaches down and gets the loan officer to change the terms. If that must have... Your father must have processed that to think, okay, if I get to the right person, I can get it done.
That's always his feeling. Always. I mean, that's always been his advice, like my whole life, which, I have not always taken. And it's not like it always helped him. Yeah. Like it was amazing that he finally got through to Walter Wriston, but it was too late. He had already filed Chapter 11. You know what I mean? So it's not like it always helped him. But yes, that is always has been and still is his MO.
There's a common belief that it's the chain stores that are killing the locally owned small businesses, but your father was actually able to beat the whiz and survive Crazy Eddie, who was so crazy, it turns out he did 8 years for federal fraud charges.
Yeah.
How was Alan able to stand up to people like that and coexist?
Well, so, I think I mentioned this in the book so he had this theory that, and it's the same thing here. I can't remember who it is, but there's a friend of ours when they opened like another coffee shop, and it's like, well, how many coffee shops can Madison have? And he's like, oh no, the more people feel like they need coffee, like it sort of helps all coffee shops in some ways, right? And so my dad really felt like if this neighborhood becomes a place people come to because they know there's several different places they can shop for, that his hope was if they made it to Radio Clinic, they would see that actually the better deal is here and not in the chains. And so even if 8 out of 10 people don't make it to Radio Clinic, there's so many more people in the neighborhood shopping for electronics or appliances that it's going to help. And so, and it did, it did for a while. I would say, he had some glory years where he was able to try to like outmaneuver, which one was it? The Wiz. He was able to outmaneuver the Wiz. But I mean, ultimately, it kind of wears you down after a while because you can't compete on price with everything. You can compete on price with a few, but you can't compete on price with everything. So wears you down.
But the thing that the chains absolutely do kill are the neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Explain what losing a small business in place of a chain does to that neighborhood.
Yeah, so just to back up for a second, one of my favorite things was I went through the phone book records over 80 years. So you could see that on each block, there could be as many as 30 businesses, right? And like each business like did its one thing. And so they were just lively blocks, and then, fast forward to the early 2000s, and there could just be 3 stores per block. And, one is half a block long drugstore, and so I don't remember the exact quote, but this is a quote my dad had in the early days of the gentrification, which is, and he sort of circled back to the looting. If it's a small neighborhood store that has deep roots and can't just pick up and go somewhere else, right? Because they just financially can't pick up and go somewhere else the way a chain can. If the neighborhood has trouble, like if things, the neighborhood is falling apart in some way or on economic hard times, the small business isn't going to leave. Because it can't leave. But a chain store they can just close it because they have, 50 other places. And so a small business is going to stick around, whether the neighborhood's doing well or not doing well at any particular time. And so I think that is a big difference.
We're talking to Jen Rubin. Her book is We Are Staying: 80 Years in the Life of a Family, a Store, and a Neighborhood. As we've been implying leading up to all along, it's actually the gentrification that ultimately killed Radio Clinic and all the other small businesses. Gentrification is good up to a point, but if left unchecked, it becomes deadly. Explain how housing programs and tax policies brought such a complete change to the Upper West Side that housing for yuppies replaced SROs and what that did to the underpinnings of the economy?
Yeah, so I always get a little leery because I'm not, not an economist, and I might not say it well, but it really started to happen under Ed Koch. So Ed Koch was the mayor, I think, starting. So looting was 1977, so he was mayor starting in 1978, and so he, and I think I had mentioned a lot of middle class, probably mostly white middle class families had left because the city was really deteriorating. So he was encouraging what he called urban pioneers to move to the city. And he has this quote. Let's see, I think I wrote it down. Let's see. Yeah, it's like a better city requires the one ingredient that money cannot buy, people who are willing to give of themselves. And that quote always really bothered me because, of course, activists had been giving of themselves for decades, and trying to have the neighborhoods be good neighborhoods. But he was not thinking of those people, right? He really wanted to bring back middle class families and upper middle class families to just change the composition of the neighborhood, bring more money in, bring more of a tax base. And what I don't remember, but it's in the book, is the changes he made tax-wise to make that easier, to make it easier for people to come in and get these brownstones and convert them back to being just for one family as opposed to for two or three families. So he just put a lot of muscle into those tax changes to make that possible. And again, like you said, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that it's circled so quickly because this neighborhood was such a prime neighborhood. It's nestled in between Central Park and the Hudson River and the Hudson River Park, and it's right near some of the best public transportation in the city. So it's a really attractive neighborhood. And so the pressure for people coming in who had a lot of money just kept circling really quickly. And I think that's where like that term, the yuppies, like that was sort of like the first like enclave for just young urban professionals who have just tons of money to spend moving in. And so the reason why there was interest in commercial rent stabilization was, can we protect these businesses from going out? Because the rents were increasing 100%, 200%, 300%. And, you're not going to pay 300% more for a roll of tape. So there's only so much a small business can do, and the rent started to become just untenable.
So even without the blackout and the looting, were the demographic changes and the urban planning policy and tax policy changes so great that the store couldn't have survived without commercial rent stabilization?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think about this right now with what's happening to our small businesses right now during the pandemic, right? And so there's lots of variables about what's going to allow a small business to survive this. Some is about what kind of government money are we going to get, what kind of local support, all of that. But I also think how healthy a business is moving into the crisis matters, And so I think for my family business, the ripple effects of the debt from the looting was definitely a bit of an albatross around the neck of the business. And so so that was a variable. But at the end of the day, I mean, what can you do with that kind of rent hike? Over time, you really can't withstand it over time.
In retrospect, did your father invest too much personal money and stay too long before finally selling the business?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing I think that's interesting about small business stories, right? Is the person who owns it's a human being with their own strengths and weaknesses and faults. And so my dad, again, with the compulsive optimism, I think he always just felt like, let me just roll the dice one more time. Let me just put in some more personal money to get over this hurdle. And there was always another hurdle. So then it became an issue of, well, if I get out of the business now, I've now just lost all of my, retirement money. But if I stay in, then I'm putting in more money. So it was a bit of he got himself into a tough situation for sure.
How difficult was it as a daughter to address business decisions your father made and potential tensions between your parents over economic pressures and those little intra-family aspects?
Yeah, so I think in some ways it was easier for me than for my brother because I live in the Midwest and my brother, lived in New York with them. it's also hard to figure out, is it because he's the oldest and I'm the youngest, or he's a boy and I'm a girl? Like, I don't know, but like, it wasn't as hard for me, I think, as it was for my brother. Partly no one ever asked me my opinion, in the way they asked him for his opinion. But I really saw my role as just to be a support for my dad. He would definitely call like for a refuge just to not have to think about it. But I mean, it was tough. I think there was probably 8 years of his life where the business could go under any second, and that was very tense for him, and hard for all of us to see, because we all were pretty sure we'd make different decisions. Whether we would have or not, who knows if we were in it, but from the outside, we definitely thought we'd make different decisions than he was making. So
there's a very revealing quote when you tell him at one point, you're not asking how the business is, you're asking how he is. And he says, telling you how the business is doing is telling you how I'm doing.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, his whole life was wrapped up in that business. It was more than 12 hours a day of his life. It was the family business that he inherited, and that was it was hard for him to think of other things besides that. I think he missed a lot of. He's not the only father this is true of, but he missed a lot of his kids' lives because he was, at the store and afraid to leave it, because it just felt like at any minute there was a chunk of years where it felt like at any minute it could go under. So.
And how connected were you to all this as it was going on?
I wasn't as connected because I was in the Midwest, and so I would talk to my brother, I'd hear his point of view. I talked to my mom, hear her point of view. I talked to my dad, and he didn't want to talk about it, yeah, but I mean, I knew what was happening, and even writing the book, it was still sort of hard to quite see how he kept it going as long as he did. I mean, it's still not quite sure how he got it limping forward as long as he did. Although part of it was, like I said, putting in personal money. And then also, if you have a heat wave, if you have one incredibly hot summer, that can carry the store for a while. So
if you see the haze rising over the Empire State Building as you drive over the George Washington Bridge, it's going to be a good day.
Exactly. That was his happiest sight. Yeah.
The book has three. The subtitle refers to a family, a store, and a neighborhood, and at times each of those is the primary focus. How did you decide on this order for the subtitle?
Well, so I changed that many times, because when I first started writing the book, I was so interested in the policies, just to me so interesting, and I really had the policy forward a lot more than it is now. And then and then particularly in conversations with my brother, he's like, there are so many writers, reporters, academics who have written the story of that neighborhood. Like, you don't need to, first of all, they probably did it better than you would because they've studied it longer, but what you have is the story of the family business. And so that was sort of my reminder of, oh yeah, I'm a storyteller. I tell stories all the time. So then I did a version that was like sort of just the story. And I pulled out the policy, but I didn't like that one because, like I said earlier, I feel like Radio Clinic's story is only interesting in how it's the story of all small businesses, right? And so I played around with it, and I finally just realized that human stories are just more interesting, so I moved the family front and center, and then I tried to weave enough policy around it that it kind of informed the story but didn't smother the story.
Yeah, I don't think you can understand the story of the store without understanding the way city policies and demographics affected the store. I mean, it doesn't. The story doesn't exist. The story about the store doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. That's exactly how I would say it. Yes.
What surprised you in your research, either about the policy and the demographics or your family or any aspect of it, other than the fact that your grandfather was an informant for the FBI?
Yeah, that was fun to find out. So the thing that was interesting for me, I had this moment where I worried that I was going to have to weigh in on whether my dad or the business was ultimately a success or a failure. And I was like, oh, I don't know what I want to, maybe I don't even want to write the book if I have to weigh in on this. It's a very, that had been a tense issue for many years in my family. And so I was doing some research, and I came across someone from Fordham Law School, I think in 1986, wrote like a 50-page report looking at commercial rent stabilization, which was an open question at the time. And because it was a law school report, they had footnoted, had 1,000 footnotes. And so following those footnotes, I could find every article written about every business that went under during, like a 5-year period. And so I looked them all up and I read all of them. And I realized that actually it didn't matter if my dad was the best salesman, business owner ever or the worst, because all those businesses went down. You know what I mean? Like it could have been a stodgy business. It could have been an innovative business. It could have been there for 4 generations or new. Like the rent got all of them. And so that really helped me realize that was the story, right? The story was, what does high rents do to a business? And then my dad had his own personal human response to it. And every store owner had their own personal response. But that was really useful research to find all of those stories from the 80s.
The story has a very sad, almost anticlimactic denouement where you can't even get in for a final goodbye. Talk about the last days of the store.
Oh, yeah. So first of all, my family had been paying rent to the landlord family for 2 generations, right? Like, so the family that, well, the thing that people might not know about New York that you and I know is, because I was asked this a lot at book talks, why didn't he just buy the business? But the business is on the commercial floor of like a 10-story building that's half a block wide, so you can't just own that business. You know what I mean? Like it's you have to own the whole building, which you can't own the whole building. So anyhow, so my family had been paying rent to this family for 2 generations. And then the person who took the business over from my dad closed it really abruptly and was just gone. And we happened to be in New York for a funeral. And so we asked if we could get in just to take some photos inside the store. But they wouldn't let us in. So we took photos from the outside. But the thing that was great is while we were taking photos, and my dad hadn't owned the store now for like 6 or 7 years, just as people were walking by, they'd be like, "Hey, Mr. Radio Clinic," and then people would stop and take photos with us. And that was fun.
Yeah.
So
we've got a couple of minutes left. We first met when you were working at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, and I, in fact, bought my copy of your book when we both appeared at a book festival in Edgerton.
Yeah.
How helpful was the experience of working in publicity and promotions at the press into doing your own promotions?
Well, I think the thing that was useful for me working at the press is, so I ended up self-publishing my book because it took me 6 years to write it. By the time I finished, my dad was 82, and I wasn't having an easy time finding a publisher. And then in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, maybe the book's no good anyhow. So, what if, and I knew working at the press that once a publisher takes you on, it could be 1.5 years. And I'm like, well, what if my dad's dead by the time I get it published? And I really to me, the most important thing was doing these book talks with my dad and him enjoying it, because I sort of got to rewrite a new final chapter for the store. So I think working at the press gave me the confidence that I knew, like I hired the people that the press hires. So it gave me the confidence that I put out a really good quality book. So that more than anything was the most useful thing, I would say.
And how did you find the whole experience of self-publishing?
So in terms of the product I put out, like I'm proud of how the book looks. And so I like all that about it. It's unless I'm either slightly famous or incredible at self-promotion, it's pretty hard for anyone to know that the book exists. So I have to just keep reminding myself how much fun my dad and I had doing book talks last year. And that, so I liked it in that way. Like I got it out while my dad was alive and I like the quality of it, but it's pretty hard to let anyone know your book exists, outside of that.
Well, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And we got about 2 minutes left. What are you working on now in terms of podcasts and focusing on local small businesses?
I think it's coming out this week. I'm doing a series for the Isthmus because one of the things that my dad talks about that always really annoyed him after the looting is that no one asked what came next for the small businesses that were looted. So I'm going to follow 3 businesses now during the safer at home order, and then follow back up with them for a year just to kind of check in with them as things evolved, because this is a pretty catastrophic time, well, for all of us, and for small businesses. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is Tequila Benson and I do a podcast called Inside Stories. And because we can't meet right now, people are actually sending us in their life during COVID-19 stories, and we've been putting them out on our podcast. So if anyone's interested in submitting one, we'd love to hear your stories.
And you're going to be working on any new books?
I do have a book I'm working on. I thought I actually meant to be working on it now, but I have pandemic brain and can't focus. So. Are you getting writing done right now? Are you able to do writing?
You know, I do the show, and I do the Madison in the 60s thing, and that occupies me enough, and that keeps me focused enough. And beyond that, I'm just doing, going through files and just preparing for what's next.
I have 2 of my great aunts. They're in their 70s now. They were here. They came to Madison in the 60s, and they love your book. I sent them your book. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
On that mutually supportive note, we are out of time. My thanks to Jen Rubin. Again, the book is We Are Staying, 80 Years in the Life of a Family, a Store, and a Neighborhood. It is available at A Room of One's Own downtown and Mystery to Me on Monroe Street. Jen's website is rubinjen.com. Next week on Madison BookBeat, Dick Wagner with his book We've Been Here All Along, about Wisconsin's early gay history. There are 2 locally sponsored book events this week to tell you about. Both of them are on Thursday night. At 6 o'clock, Mystery to Me will host Wisconsin author Joanne Rebar for a discussion of her new mystery novel, Deep Bitter Roots. You can find out more about that at mysterytomebooks.com. And at 9 o'clock, Wisconsin Book Festival will hook you up with the Bay Area Book Festival for an important program entitled Courts, COVID-19, and Voter Suppression. Author Richard Hassan, his book is Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. Alan Hirsch, author of A Short History of Presidential Election Crises. Abdi Soltani, the executive director of the ACLU of Northern California. And Lala Wu, the co-founder of Sister District. You can find out further details at wisconsinbookfestival.org. That is it for us today. On behalf of engineer Liz Stottleman, News and Public Affairs Director Shali Pittman, and all of us here at Madison BookBeat, I'm Stu Levitan. Thank you for listening. Now, as Ben Sidran plays us out with a bit of Little Sherry, please stay tuned for Alex Wilding White and All Around Jazz. You are listening to WORT 89.9 FM Madison, listener-sponsored community radio.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.